Welcome to The Food Chain, your weekly programme about the culture, science and business of food. I'm Emily Thomas. If I told you this episode was about a single food that could prevent and cure all cancer, would you be more likely to listen closely? Would you give me half an hour of your time, even though you probably know it's unlikely that one food would have that power? And then, even if a rather opaque and confusing discussion followed about the properties of pomegranates and blueberries, say, would you be tempted to start eating more of them anyway? What is it about food and hope? Messages about foods having dramatic health effects are everywhere. From newspaper headlines shouting about the latest superfood, to self-proclaimed wellness gurus and bloggers Instagramming their food journey to a perfect life, many of them making big wads of cash as they go. It seems many of us are asking the question, how can food save me? And there's a huge appetite for unsubstantiated advice. Even though science has provided some answers, we hear them time and time again. The evidence, so far, points to a varied, balanced diet. But still, we look for the silver bullet. And this week's programme is about that search. It's not that we're saying there isn't untapped potential for food to transform our health and well-being. There may well be. But we want to find out why we're so susceptible to messages about food which aren't evidence-based.
Underneath a lot of this really kind of what's the harm diet advice is much more sinister messaging, and because you can create your own reality on social media, I wasn't really seeing anything that would counter it, and I was naive and I didn't think further than that.
We'll explore how big business is fueling these messages and sometimes being fooled by them.
I think it seems extraordinary to a lot of people that the most valuable company in the world would not even bother to check the most basic claims made by someone that they're holding up as a star app developer. It's astonishing.
And in this confusing world where scientists and pseudoscientists and bloggers and businesses are all telling us they know best about the potential of food to mend or cure or heal, where does the power really lie? And has a simple truth about the value of a balanced and varied diet got lost in all the noise?
I found people who had the same or similar conditions to me who said that they had cured themselves through healthy eating.
Natasha Lippman is 28, a journalist living in London. She suffered from chronic illness since she was 9. Her illness prevented her from joining us in the studio, and we've decided to talk over Skype. As you'll hear, she's articulate and intelligent. So why did she believe the extreme and unsubstantiated diet advice she found online?
Most of these blogs that I found and most of these interviews had some really consistent themes throughout them. They would be cutting out meat and dairy and gluten and sugar, and every single thing you put in your mouth was a decision to heal or make yourself worse. I thought, fine, great, these are foods that might help me, so what's the harm?
What's the harm? But you're a journalist, you're used to thinking critically. Why did you accept so much of what you read, do you think?
Because the medicine didn't help me. There's a lot of people who live in that middle ground where you have a condition or conditions that aren't very well researched and don't have many treatment options. And when you've been through all of them and nothing has worked, you're just kind of left. And it is an absolutely heartbreaking situation to be in, because I was, my mid-20s, and I thought my life was over. I didn't think I had anything to live for. When you go online and you see pictures of people who are in the same situation as you, and they did something as simple as eating more fruits and vegetables and cutting out bread, your brain in its desperation is going to say, maybe it can help me too. And I think we often underestimate the power of desperation and the power of being left.
And at what point did your diet change?
almost overnight, really. I started to just compile a list of foods that were good and a list of foods that were bad. Let's see if I can remember it. I used to have a spiel. So plant-based, gluten-free, high nutrient, anti-inflammatory, rotation, antihistamine, no sugar. There's a whole bunch of stuff.
What was there left to eat? What was left on the menu?
Blended fruits and vegetables and nuts, some quinoa, brown rice pasta. Oh, I also have to say, I spent far more time styling the food than I did eating it. And most of the time the food would be cold because I would be taking pretty Instagram pictures. It's very freeing not having to style a bowl of porridge before eating the porridge. And the hashtags would be, hashtag clean eating, hashtag vegan, hashtag wellness. You would tag every single brand and hope that they would regram you. It's a really enticing thing. It felt so empowering for the first time in my life to say I am taking control of my health, even though underneath a lot of this really kind of what's the harm diet advice is much more sinister messaging about curing cancer with juicing and vaccinations being bad that I even kind of started to believe. And because you can create your own reality on social media, I wasn't really seeing anything that would counter it.
And you were feeding into the clean eating world yourself through your Instagram posts and becoming part of that community.
It was a really weird, insular community. And all of my friends over the period of 6 months to a year, I made on Instagram. And because you don't really think about it very deeply when you get into it, you don't necessarily think about the impact that that could be having on other people.
When was it that you realised that something needed to change and that your behaviour had become extreme?
I was saying I was doing all of this stuff, but at the same time I was having flare-up after flare-up and feeling more and more poorly. And I felt like anything apart from those foods that I had deemed to be healthy would be harming me in some way. And the thing that was the most difficult was that I would have people, even when I was very restrictive, saying, oh, you need to cut out all of your grains, otherwise you won't get better. And when I started to add other foods back into my diet, people literally would call me and say, it's no surprise that you're ill. I was never being pure enough. I was never trying hard enough, even though, I'm getting I want to cry. It's a really weird feeling because it's not my fault that I'm ill. And I think I've totally maybe lost 4,000 to 8,000 Instagram followers. I'm not quite sure how many. I went for my first pizza when I stopped being into all of that stuff and I cried because I thought I was hurting myself. I was crying out of joy and fear.
Natasha Lippman there. She turned to bloggers and social media for diet advice because she wanted to alleviate the pain of her illness. But healthy people do this too. Which makes me wonder, do humans have a particular vulnerability when it comes to food that makes hope stronger than reason?
People definitely get emotional about food, and also since we all, most of us eat every day, people feel like their lifetime of experience eating somehow makes them experts at food, or at least that their anecdotal experience is enough for them to have strong opinions about food.
Stephen Novella is Assistant Professor of Neurology at Yale University in Connecticut in the US. And he's also Executive Editor of Science-Based Medicine, a website which aims to explain scientific controversies.
For some reason, we attach a lot of morality to food. Clean food is similar to having clean morality, like a clean soul.
And why is there that emotional baggage with food?
Well, yeah, that's a complex psychological question. I'm not sure
Give it a go.
We fully understand it. I mean, it's wrapped up with our culture, with our family, with our relationships. Obviously, just on a basic neurological level, we need food to live. We have a huge emotional investment in obtaining food and having enough food. And then also we have other emotions involved, like the emotion of disgust, which is supposed to motivate us to avoid food which is bad for us. In fact, interestingly, the emotion of disgust as it relates to food often correlates with moral disgust. We tend to feel physical revulsion and we have the same kind of reaction to things that we consider to be morally disgusting. We even use the same word.
I'm particularly interested in the idea of hope and food. Where do you think that connection comes in?
Any physician will tell you, any expert will tell you, diet and exercise is sort of at the center of healthy living. But people then take that too far. I think they want to be able to cure anything with food. And I should be able to eat some magical combination of foods or just avoid the wrong food, and that will cure my multiple sclerosis, or I'll never get cancer, or whatever. There's a lot of wishful thinking, just generic, just wishful thinking about health that then attaches itself to food, because people think it's sort of the easy, the no-risk, natural way to achieve whatever health goals they have.
Do you think that certain people are more vulnerable than others? You've mentioned people with illnesses, but people who are healthy, do you think there are certain people that are more likely to believe some of these myths about food?
It correlates well with people who have actually a fairly high level of education, but that may be more just its association with having a lot of disposable income, which is definitely a predictive factor. So people who, have the ability to spend money on things like this and have, a certain level of education and have a certain philosophical approach where they want to treat themselves with things that are quote unquote natural. And what we find is that having more education makes people feel more confident and makes them feel more open to what would otherwise be considered fringe ideas, but doesn't necessarily prepare them with the level of scientific knowledge that you would need or the critical thinking skills that you would need to then deconstruct those claims. You don't get that until you get to like a graduate level of science education. So at the highest levels, then belief in all this stuff drops off like a cliff, it plummets.
Is the situation you're describing something that's mostly coming from the States, or is it something that we see right across the globe?
Definitely, I see this across the globe. Some countries do export more of this than others, and I think the United States is probably the biggest exporter of pseudoscience. But this is an international problem. This is rampant in many places. In some countries, I think it's even a bigger problem, like in India and China, just because there already is a culture there of traditional or natural medicine. The philosophy is already there, right? So the ground is very fertile for this kind of thing, and that gets massively exploited.
Do you think there are particular types of diets or myths about food that have more power?
Yeah, I think one basic approach to, the myths of eating is to treat foods as either good or bad, right? You have good foods. If you eat this, you're going to be healthy, and you have bad foods. You need to avoid these foods because they're going to damage your health. It's kind of a simplistic approach, which is also, there's a psychological motivation to try to reduce the complexities of the world to simplistic rules that we can manage, right? Most of it is not true. There's very few things that are just inherently good or bad. It usually comes down more to, a good variety of food, and don't eat too much of any one thing, or don't eliminate foods from your diet. You're going to be okay. You'll get everything you need, and you won't get too much of the things that you shouldn't get too much of. But there is no one magical food to avoid, there's no superfoods, right? There's no foods that has some jet fuel nutrition that's going to do anything different than any other kind of regular food.
How much damage do you think all this pseudoscience, all these messages about food that promises the world, how much damage do you think they're doing?
It's hard to quantify, obviously, how much damage it's all doing, but it certainly is massively counterproductive. So I think, it does also drown out the real evidence, and it also causes a lot of confusion. It's in some individual cases, it can get to the point where this isn't a generally accepted term yet, but people have proposed a new term called orthorexia that basically says the obsession with clean eating can get to the point where it actually becomes an eating disorder, where people become so focused on avoiding bad foods and eating only the correct foods that they get increasingly restrictive diets, which are actually unhealthy. But of course, there's a whole continuum, right? So there's a lot of people who may not be at the disorder level, but they certainly are spending a lot of time, money, and effort obsessing about details that haven't really been shown to be helpful, when in fact they would be doing much better for themselves if they just focused on the few things that we actually know rigorously to be true.
Steven Novella there. He's explained why people might be particularly vulnerable to messages about food and its power to cure. But it's not just individuals. You're about to hear an extraordinary story of a young Australian woman who convinced hundreds of thousands of people and several large companies that food could work miracles. Belle Gibson claimed to have cured her terminal brain cancer with a healthy diet, sharing recipes and lifestyle tips on social media.
food is just being used more and more often by people looking to exploit the vulnerable.
This is Beau Donnelly, an Australian journalist living in Ireland. 3 years ago, he began to investigate Bell's claims, and he's since co-written a book about what he found.
Within a few months, she had more than 200,000 people, many of whom were young women and many of whom had cancer or knew someone who had cancer. They wrote of sharing a spiritual connection and an emotional bond with her. And really what we saw is that they were really inspired by her story of survival.
What kind of things did she post?
Photographs of herself and of food, and there were these highly curated, beautiful shots. She'd also post photographs of recipes that she'd created, and then she'd post about the brain cancer spreading to multiple organs. And then she might follow up those posts with a certain so-called superfood. And she diagnosed her followers with medical conditions like irritable bowel syndrome. When she launched her app, it became a bestseller overnight. It just blew up, and she had about 300,000 downloads in a very short space of time. What happened next was that Apple got in contact with her and they gave her a bunch of awards, and they praised her for lighting the path for this whole new industry of wellness apps. And her app was just one of 11 in the world out of more than 2 million on the App Store that year, which was featured on all Apple Watch promotions. They were trying to get her into profile pieces in newspapers as a young, savvy app developer. And following the success of the app, Bell pitched a cookbook to Penguin in Australia, and that too was immediately a bestseller. They had her working with Jamie Oliver's team at Penguin in the UK. So really she was on the cusp of enjoying much more success. I started looking into it, and I worked with my colleague Nick Toscano, and we started sort of picking apart her claims that she'd made. And so Belle Gibson had lied about her age, her cancer diagnosis, her philanthropic activities, you know, where she'd grown up, where she'd gone to school, where she'd worked. She'd lied pretty much about everything.
What was the reaction of the companies, Apple and Penguin, when she was exposed?
Penguin never fact-checked any claims that she made, and for their role they were fined $30,000 in the state of Victoria in Australia. They have to put a warning label on any sort of alternative health and wellness book or cookbook that offers unproven medical advice now. They've also changed the way they go about vetting their authors. I guess the average person would expect that this would happen before a book is published anyway, and that this would have happened before 2016, but apparently it didn't. Apple have made no public statement about Belle Gibson. They've wiped their hands off her, though. They cut all ties with her almost immediately.
It seems extraordinary that they wouldn't check before they threw their weight behind her.
Yeah, I think it seems extraordinary to a lot of people that the most valuable company in the world would not even bother to check the most basic claims made by someone that they're holding up as a star app developer. It's astonishing. Their response has been that they really don't look into the stories of the app developers, they look into the functionality of the app. Really, that's all I can say on the matter, because that's all they've told us.
Was what she did actually illegal?
In Australia, she was prosecuted under consumer law, and she was ultimately fined in the Federal Court of Australia $410,000. In other countries, people who have done what Belle Gibson have done have been jailed for making claims.
And do you think it's made any difference?
Really, in the mainstream, I don't think so. I think there's so much misinformation out there. There's a lot of people who are willing to make a buck off baseless nutrition advice when they have no qualifications to give it, and there's a lot of desperate people willing to listen.
Beau Donnelly. You're listening to The Food Chain on the BBC World Service with me, Emily Thomas. This week, we're talking about our vulnerability to messages about food as salvation. We've just heard about a woman who fooled hundreds of thousands of people into believing she'd cured her brain cancer with food. It didn't happen in a vacuum. Social media, a receptive audience, and big business ready to cash in all helped create this perfect storm. So, how to unpick where the power lies and who or what is to blame?
Publishers, app developers, brands want to make money. So they are going to cradle anyone that is popular on social media. And they don't care whether it's morally or ethically right or wrong.
Daniela Isaacs is an actress and writer who's just finished performing a run of her one-woman show, Hear Me Raw, in London. That's Raw spelt R-A-W. It's based on her past experience as a self-styled online wellness guru, unhealthily obsessed with healthy eating, and ghostwriting for some of Instagram's most influential health bloggers.
We need people to have actual qualifications because these people don't. I've seen it. There are some out there, and I'm not shaming the entire wellness industry. There is truth in it, which is also the scary thing, because right at the centre of it, it's saying eat fresh food as often as you can, move your body. But it's when we give a kind of rule book that is meant to apply to every single one of us that it gets scary, because what my body needs will be very different to what your body needs.
Do you see your show as part of a dialogue that's growing about the problems with the wellness industry?
I made the decision to write my show about a year ago. And within that year, the anti-wellness, tribe is growing thick and fast. But the desire for wellness is growing just as strongly. I don't know how this obsession with wellness ends when we are so addicted to looking at beautiful images on a screen. It's very difficult to break through that.
What about the anti-wellness industry, as you call it? Is there any money in that?
I think there is. And that was another thing.
I mean, there's your show.
There is my
show.
Anything
else?
I wish I was making money from that.
Are we seeing books published?
Yeah, we are. And that's very interesting. And I actually find myself thinking, this is difficult too. There will be a rise now, or there is a rise in anti-wellness. But I reckon that will be superseded very quickly by a new version of wellness. Because what the wellness industry is essentially the diet industry upgraded for millennials. And then what's going to happen next is the wellness industry will recognise the fact that it's getting bad press. So it will be rebranded to maybe something like the self-care movement.
Daniela Isaacs there. For her, consumerism has a lot to answer for. That and those peddling pseudoscience on the internet. But would people be less receptive to those messages if the scientific community was better at getting its point across about the benefits of a varied diet?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much I'm willing to blame nutritionists for not sensationalizing the truth.
Here's Stephen Novella from Yale University again.
Your science says your mommy was right. Eat your vegetables. If you do that, that gets you like 95+% of the way to a perfect diet. And then everything else is seriously diminishing returns. But I think the real problem is the multi-billion-dollar self-help and dieting industry, because you can't make money off that message. It's too simple. There's got to be enough complexity in there to fill a book and to sell it,
Aren't scientists partly to blame in other ways by putting out thousands of papers claiming that any number of foods can help lessen your chances of getting this illness or that illness, and then these papers being refuted later on? People have lost trust.
So the problem is not so much that these studies are being done, it's how they're being reported. And overhyping the results of these individual studies before they've had the chance to go through the whole process. It could take 5, 10, 15, 20 years sometimes for that whole sequence of research to work itself out. In the meantime, we have all these preliminary results, which are necessary. They get reported by the media as if they're definitive studies.
But the media hear about it in the first place through the university press departments who get their information from the scientists. Is this that there's a lot of pressure on the scientists to be publishing reports, to be getting their science in the newspapers?
So fortunately, we don't have to guess because there's actually been research looking at that very question. It actually does frequently go back to the press office. They probably do it the most. But sometimes it does originate with the scientists and sometimes it does originate with the journalists themselves. The food industry is playing their role in all this as well. And there's this sometimes not so subtle deception involved in the labeling and the marketing of food products because they're capitalizing on whatever the latest fad is, and sometimes multiple fads at the same time. There's a whole ecosystem of marketing products and bloggers who are selling those products and also promoting the lifestyle. So, for example, there are very popular natural health or natural food websites that are ostensibly just promoting information to the public, but that information is carefully curated. Anything natural is good, anything artificial is bad, and there's a conspiracy among the experts, the elitists, they're lying to you, but really this is the real information. Oh, and by the way, you could buy all these products which are on the sidebar. It's unfortunately a very successful business model that we see replicated over and over again.
What do you think should be done about all this?
If you just give people facts, they'll just incorporate them into their belief system. You have to give people a critical thinking, scientific narrative. But that's a huge multi-generational investment, that we're talking about there. I think the scientific community, they need to engage with their press office. They need to engage with journalists. They need to engage directly with the public. Governments need to think carefully about how to regulate the kind of health claims that we should allow in the marketplace. There's always this conflict between freedom of speech and fraud prevention. We've gotten out of balance now where we're in an anything goes kind of wild west of healthcare claims. As long as you're not cutting people open or giving actual drugs, we kind of look the other way. But I think we need to rethink that as well. I think if you're giving people specific medical advice, at some point what you're doing is indistinguishable from practicing medicine, and you should be held to account for that.
Stephen Novella there.
Won't you believe me?
That's all for this week. If you're interested in what you've heard, you might like to go to our website and listen back to an episode on orthorexia nervosa from April 2017. Go to bbc.co.uk/The Food Chain. And let us know what you think about what you've heard this week. Find us on social media using the hashtag BBC Food Chain, or I'm on Twitter @EmilyThomasBBC. For now, from me and the rest of the team, editor Sarah Stollartz and producer Nishi Sundar, thanks for listening, and join us again for The Food Chain next week.